Sato Company.
Hi, I'm Steve Jobs.
Believe it or not, Steve Jobs did not invent anything. He was neither an engineer nor a computer wizard nor a scientist, and yet without him no one would ever have witnessed the Macintosh or the iMac. No one would ever have listened to music on an iPod or made a phone call using an iPhone. And of course, no one would ever have surfed on an iPad. Jobs did not design his products, but well before anyone else, he understood that they would change our lives.
Take a look at the screen, and I can move the screen with just a touch.
The coolest thing about iPod is that your entire music library fits in your pocket.
A phone and an internet communicator. This is one device, and we are calling it iPhone. And here we are, right at the New York Times. You can see how fast it is.
He presented each new product as an insight into the future, and he made it all so very cool. He was a visionary, an incredibly charismatic boss, and had excellent communication skills. But he was also authoritarian, ruthless, and a megalomaniac.
It's just like this.
Steve Jobs envisions himself as one of the great cultural or political world leaders of our time.
There are a few special people in the world, the Shakespeares, the Newtons, a few of them, and he saw himself as one of them, the way he talked about it, and everybody else are just ants, and they are worthless, and they don't mean anything.
So how did this self-taught man with such a highly developed sense of his own self-worth build up one of the largest companies of his time? Steve Jobs' life is above all the story of a man who wanted to dominate the world through IT, a cruel world with no holds barred. Steve Jobs was born in San Francisco, California on the 24th of February, 1955. Things didn't get off to such a great start as his biological parents abandoned him at birth. His mother, a student who was single, and his father, a young teacher of Syrian origin, couldn't take care of him, so he was adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs, an average American couple who never had much chance to study. But the Jobses resolved to bend over backwards to send Steve to university. Young Steve grew up with his adoptive parents in the south of San Francisco in this small suburban bungalow in the heart of a valley filled with apple trees, soon to become known as Silicon Valley. But all that was still to come. At the time, computing was only in its very early stages. At school, Steve was not a great pupil and was often bored. One subject did interest him, however, electronics. Still, the boy was no genius.
Kind of an amateur, hobbyist, tinkerer, enthusiast in electronics, but he wasn't a brilliant, accomplished mind in the technical aspect.
Steve Jobs may not have been a genius, at least when he started out, but he had the right friends. Especially one, his neighbor, Steve Wozniak, who was 5 years older than him. They shared a passion for electronics, with one difference. Steve Wozniak really was a whiz kid. We meet Steve Wozniak, Jobs' former accomplice, at his home in a cozy district in Los Gatos, California.
Here they come.
He remembers spending hours on end making things as a youth, thinking up all sorts of electronic systems, and he didn't do too badly out of it.
There comes little Z. I was so excellent. Over the years, I just developed tricks that were in my head, tricks of combining chips that it's hard to believe how I did that. You can't tell another person, you can't lead another person to develop what I developed. I just did it because I tried as hard as I could for years to do better and better and better jobs without reading any books on how you do it.
Steve Wozniak's past exploits still continue to amaze him, and with good reason. He was always very advanced, a genius even. He was reading by the age of 3, and at 7, he made his own radio. By the age of 13, he knew a great deal about electronics. He produced invention after invention throughout his teenage years, the most outstanding being the blue box. the first telephone that could be used to make unlimited phone calls all over the world for free.
You put these tones into the phone, and it starts seizing phone lines and then dialing numbers for free. The phone circuits, the phone systems, equipment starts connecting you to numbers everywhere, no billing.
The phone worked perfectly, but it turned out to be illegal, so Wozniak could not do anything with it. A few years later, he was to invent the machine of the future. This is it. This wooden box made with whatever materials Wozniak had on hand. It looks rather like a toy, and yet it is the first personal computer in history. Despite its rather homespun appearance, it is nothing less than revolutionary. The year is 1976, and at the time, computers still look like this. Vast machines that fill up entire rooms with no keyboard and no screens. They're still a far cry from the home computer we know today. Compared to this great mountain of a machine, Steve Wozniak's version is a spectacular improvement. But as usual, he does not grasp the full scope of his invention until the day he shows it to his friends, and in particular to Steve Jobs.
I could go out on some tables and set up my Sears TV and my computer that I was working on designing and show off what I had. And I started getting people around me that were so amazed at how so few chips, one little board, was a whole computer.
For Steve Jobs, the machine is a revelation. From that point on, he has just one thing on his mind: to market the computer. Steve Wozniak remembers the absolute determination of his young 21-year-old friend.
But we didn't really have the idea to sell it. When Steve Jobs said, let's sell it, and I said, we may not make our money back, and he said, that's okay, we'll have a company.
And Steve Jobs has already thought of the little detail that would make all the difference.
Well, he came up with the name Apple Computer, and what an amazing name.
Apple. Wherever did that idea come from? Steve Jobs had been very influenced by the hippie movement, as well as by a mystical journey he'd made to India. In the early 1970s, Steve aspired to the ideals of the generation that wanted to change the world. Protest movements, music, drugs, he tried them all. To have a blast, his group of friends would meet up in a commune on a farm, eating apples. Dan Kotke remembers it well.
Steve and I and my girlfriend and mutual other friends had all stayed at that farm. It was an apple orchard. We had spent time harvesting apples, and since we were fruitarians at the time, we were fasting on apples.
Inspired by the hippie movement, and also in homage to Sir Isaac Newton, who discovered gravity, having received one on the head, Steve Jobs chooses the apple as his logo. The missing bite on the right side is to stop it being mistaken for a tomato. All the young hippie manager needs now is to find some clients who are interested in his revolutionary computer named Apple I. Very quickly, Jobs receives his first order, 100 units from the Byte Shop, one of the first computer specialist stores which has just opened in Silicon Valley. Biographer Owen Linsmeyer remembers the extraordinary salesmanship that Steve Jobs displayed that day, in spite of his hippie image.
You know, here's a young kid, basically a hippie, you know, walking around in sandals and shorts and a beard, coming in and asking for 30 days credit for several $1,000s worth of parts to build an unproven computer in an unproven industry. You know, back then, there was no microcomputer industry. There was no personal computer. There was just these guys with dreams in a garage.
When Steve announces his first sale to his partner, Wozniak can't quite believe it, especially given that they haven't even built a single computer yet.
When he got an order to sell fully built computers for $500 each, 100 computers is $50,000. That was twice my Hewlett-Packard salary. That was a big number. That was a financial shock.
With the first $50,000 behind them, they still need to manufacture the computers, which they do with whatever resources they have at hand. They hire their friend from their hippie years, Dan Kotke, who becomes the first Apple employee. 29 years later, Dan Kotke takes us to his first workplace.
This is Cupertino. We are almost here. Here's Chris Drive.
And it's well worth the journey. One of the largest companies in the world started out here at Steve Jobs' parents' home, at Mom and Dad's.
This is where I stayed in the summer of '76. Apple Computer started in Steve's sister's bedroom, which was in the back of the house, but then it moved to the living room. And actually, we were doing the Apple I on the living room coffee table when I showed up, and then we were kind of moving it to the garage.
Dan worked for several months in this garage, which has since become a legendary U.S. landmark. Dan is not much of a handyman and is certainly no computer whiz, neither is Jobs, but he hires Dan to do the soldering at $3.25 an hour. Not a bad wage at the time for a lowly technician.
At the time, I didn't know anything about computers, so I was just kind of tagging along. And Steve, you know, had a whole plan of what they were doing, and I had no idea what they were doing. I was just trying to help.
Manufacturing their products in a garage, hippie-style managers, Apple's first steps are a little outlandish, but their Apple I computer earns critical acclaim, and in the space of a few months, the company sells over 200 units. Not bad for a piece of equipment which up until now has been the sole preserve of IT boffins. Apple I looks a little basic and is even sold without a screen, which means its users have to hook it up to a television screen all by themselves. Operating it requires both computing and do-it-yourself skills.
The Apple I you cannot call a personal computer, and here's why. You had to be a technician to buy one of those. You had to know how to hook wires according to some diagrams on a sheet of paper. You had to learn how to hook up some monitor or get a signal into your own TV set. You had to figure out how to buy some transformers to get voltages into the computer. And so it was a little bit, you had to know some things to build it.
Steve Jobs is quick to realize that a clientele restricted to computer experts and initiates is just not enough. His ambition is to sell home computers to the mass public. So he asks Wozniak to refine his invention and make it accessible to the public at large. Wozniak gets right to work and hands in the fruit of his labors a few weeks later, Apple II.
What's in here is all of the code that was in an Apple II that made it operate. All this code without a single bug.
So you must be pretty proud of yourself.
I don't know how I did it. I never do that again. Yes, I am proud. I'm proud what that was. Yeah.
Wozniak has no idea how he did it. Steve even less so, but they have something the others don't have: vision. Firstly, it has a lot to do with the design. Apple II has lost that homemade appearance. It's enclosed in plastic casing and comes with a monitor and a disk drive. Jobs has just transformed some obscure machine into an object of mass consumption.
The Apple II was revolutionary in that it was the first computer of the time, the personal computer of its time, that was a complete computer, that was ready to go out of the box. It was really a consumer device.
All that remains now is to convince American families to acquire this future product for their homes. And Steve Jobs has the answer to that one: advertising. This is his first campaign. The Apple II is represented at the heart of family life. From the comfort of his own kitchen, Mr. Apple II owner can check his shares on the stock market. In the late 1970s, that still belongs in the realm of science fiction. And that's where Steve Jobs' genius lies, bringing technology into our daily lives and, 20 years before the era of internet, being the first to imagine simple, useful, and entertaining products that will change people's lives. It's 1970, and young engineer Andy Hertzfield has just been hired by Jobs. Andy remembers the new computer's dizzying success the moment it went on sale.
Selling 1,000 computers a month was a huge hit for Apple. They were happy to sell 1,000 computers a month back in 1978.
The two founders posed proudly for posterity. By the early 80s, their adventure has become a success story. Just 4 years after starting out in a garage, the small firm has become a key Silicon Valley company. The Apple II has conquered America. 300,000 units have been sold, and now it even equips schools. U.S. school kids learn computing on the Apple II. In the late 80s, the young company is listed on the stock market and the floodgates open. Nearly 5 million Apple shares are snapped up within minutes, and the company's value leaps 32% on the first day. The two young Steves become millionaires overnight. Jobs is 25 and Wozniak is 30. Their combined net worth is $300 million. Their lifestyles explode accordingly. This is Wozniak's Porsche with its Apple II license plate.
Never owned my own house in my life. I'd never have enough money. I didn't think I'd ever have enough money in my life for a vacation to Hawaii even. That's how I was. And all of a sudden, whoa, now I've got everything. Yeah, so it was a nice feeling.
But gradually, the brilliant inventor withdraws from the company, preferring to devote himself to his passions, cobbling together strange inventions, or even organizing big folk music concerts. What's more, having Steve Jobs as your partner isn't easy. He just never has enough. He wants to control everything, absolutely everything. For Jobs, the adventure was only beginning. The young boss of this first startup in history becomes the darling of the media. Icon of a new generation, he features on the covers of top magazines, presented as a guru of Silicon Valley. And his aura spreads across the Atlantic. Here's how he was presented on French TV in the early 80s.
The example to follow, the goal to reach, is that of the employee who becomes a millionaire by setting up his own company. Such is the case of Steve Jobs, inventor of Apple microcomputers.
He was on the cover of Time magazine when he was 27 years old. He was worth hundreds of millions of dollars and was a cultural hero in his 20s.
Steve Jobs, who already was not exactly modest, would become a total megalomaniac. His goal was to become the undisputed leader of the IT world. Nothing less would do. This is 1981. The IT sector is dominated by IBM, at the time one of the world's biggest multinationals. Employing over 350,000 people, it makes most of the world's mainframe computer systems. Yet that year, IBM in turn decides to take on the personal computer market by launching the IBM PC, largely inspired by the Apple II. Will this heavyweight competitor manage to undermine Apple's newfound supremacy? The response of Jobs and his teams is a definite no. They didn't believe for 1 second in the future of the IBM PC, and they even chose to celebrate with fruit juice.
We rushed out and we got one and immediately started taking it apart. And we just started laughing at when we saw how poorly it was designed.
Initially, the people at Apple looked at the IBM and said, what a piece of crap this machine is. It doesn't do anything, interesting. It's not, doesn't have the graphics capabilities that this has. It doesn't deal with the disk operating system the same way ours does. It doesn't have the software. It's a big, clunky, ugly box.
Yet despite Steve Jobs' scorn for the PC, it sells well. It even eats into the Apple II's market share, but its success came down to just 3 letters.
But that big, clunky, ugly box had the letters on it, IBM. And for too many people at that time, IBM was a safe bet, and they were willing to buy IBM over anything else, no matter how good the competition was.
His pride hurt, Steve Jobs decides to react. Convinced of his superiority, he wants to crush IBM. It becomes his obsession. And to lead this war, he sets out to recruit a businessman. And not just anybody, John Sculley, the CEO of Pepsi-Cola. The man who made his reputation by shaking up one hell of a competitor, Coca-Cola. The teaming up of the two men is headline news. Their plan to take on IBM even makes the cover of Business Week. Steve Jobs has no doubts whatsoever, as illustrated by the way in which he asked Sculley to join him.
That famously is how Steve Jobs helped attract John Sculley to come to Apple. He said, do you want to make sugared water, or do you want to have a chance to change the world?
To change the world. Such was the mission of Steve Jobs. And he'll go all out to make it happen, whatever the cost. Steve Jobs now devotes himself 100% to carrying out a major project. A computer so avant-garde that it would outstrip its competitor IBM for good. Its name, the Macintosh. To design it, he demands total devotion from his teams. His Apple engineers must be willing to sacrifice everything. For Andy Hertzfield, it wasn't all happy memories.
He came over to my cubicle. He goes, I got good news for you. You're working on the Mac now. I said, great. Just give me a day to finish up this Apple II stuff I was doing. And he goes, what's this? What stuff are you talking about? What's more important than working on the Macintosh? And I told him, my Apple II project, and he goes, that's no good, it'll come to nothing, you're starting on the Mac now. What he did was he took my Apple II and he pulled it out, he pulled the plug out. So I lost everything I was working on. And he didn't stop with that, he picked up the Apple II and started walking away with it.
He pushed his employees to the limits. You know, there's a famous story that he had T-shirts made up for the Macintosh team that said working 90 hours a week and loving it.
90-hour work weeks. After 3 years at this frenetic pace, the Macintosh is ready at last. Planned launch? January 1984. Yet 1984 was also the title of a novel by George Orwell, a futuristic book denouncing a totalitarian society dominated by a dictator, Big Brother. Steve Jobs wants to use its message. He calls upon Ridley Scott to shoot a commercial.
Let's show them why 1984 won't be like 1984.
It depicts hordes of gray, expressionless people marching robot-like into an auditorium to hear Big Brother's speech.
This all fit into Apple's vision of the world as Big Brother, IBM, and them as the saviors to Big Brother.
Hence, the slaves in the advert represent all those employees condemned to use IBM computers in their company, while the young rebel sportswoman obviously stands for the Macintosh.
They were going to break people free from the oppression of mainframes and boring stuff in business, and Apple was going to save everybody.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
The reason why the Macintosh doesn't feature in this advert is because Steve Jobs wants the privilege all for himself, that of presenting his baby to the entire world. Andy Hertzfeld recalls that famous 24th of January 1984, the day that Macintosh was revealed.
I hope they pan and show the whole auditorium. Yeah, they do. Just everyone's going nuts.
That day, before a full and frenzied auditorium, Steve Jobs staged his own consecration.
You've just seen some pictures of Macintosh. Now I'd like to show you Macintosh in person.
In a US-style show to his glory and that of his creature, he sets out to demonstrate his technological advance, to make interacting with a computer more human at last. On giant screens, we discover its animation and graphics capabilities. For the first time, a computer even lets people draw. By a way of illustration, a portrait of himself. And Jobs is more megalomaniac than ever. Just listen to what he has his machine say.
But right now, I'd like to sit back and listen. So it is with considerable pride that I introduce a man who's been like a father to me, Steve Jobs.
Steve Jobs can barely hide his emotion, persuaded that his baby will enable him to crush IBM and to become, of course, master of the world.
You see that? He really is pretty much crying.
At 29, Steve Jobs is at the pinnacle of his glory. The Mac and his demonstration are a stroke of genius. He's neither inventor nor engineer, and yet the Mac is his creature, the first personal computer ever. The press is unanimous. It's a revolution, and on the sales front, it's a knockout. Despite its costly sales price, the Macintosh is snapped up. $2,500, twice the price of an IBM machine.
The Macintosh was phenomenally successful early on. It really appealed to a group of people who had not found the computer for them, as Apple used to say, for the rest of us.
What distinguishes the Mac from all its rivals is its extreme user-friendliness. Even a child could use it, all thanks to revolutionary breakthroughs such as the mouse. The mouse, in this form, was totally new. as were the icons, menus, and windows, which appear here on a computer screen for the first time. What makes it all possible is the brain of the Macintosh, its operating system. It's 10 years ahead of its competitors. Steve Jobs is convinced that he's reached the summit, alone and unrivaled. And yet there was a hitch. Blinded by his combat with the giant IBM, he didn't see that another threat was lurking. Its name? Bill Gates, a young computer whiz kid. At 29, he's the same age as Steve Jobs, and he too set up his own company very young, Microsoft. Yet in 1984, the year of the Apple explosion, it was still just a small to medium enterprise.
Microsoft was not the big company that we all know it to be today. It was not this giant monopoly. It was far smaller than Apple at the time.
Unlike Apple, Microsoft doesn't make computers, only applications. It also makes its own operating system. Yet Bill Gates is impressed by the system equipping the Macintosh. He even publicly acclaims it.
Well, to create a new standard, it takes something that's not just a little bit different. It takes something that's really new and really captures people's imagination. And the Macintosh, of all the machines I've ever seen, is the only one that meets that standard.
No one suspects that Bill Gates has a project in mind, to crack the secret of the Macintosh. Under his own brand name, he wants to make a system that is just as developed, with the unavowed intention of selling it to Apple's rivals. But just how will he go about it? For some time, Bill Gates had been working for Apple, supplying them with software. At the time, the company's engineers felt no need to be wary of this small supplier, a fact he would take advantage of by discreetly finding out more about the Macintosh system.
I remember really clearly the very first time we showed Bill Gates a Macintosh. In some sense now, that was showing him his own future.
But it took a while for Apple to cop on to the fact, even though Bill Gates was proving increasingly curious. Everything about the Macintosh fascinated him. He asked a lot of questions, too many questions, to the point that Steve Jobs took him by surprise one day in deep discussion with Andy.
I was about to say, hey, you can even do it on an Apple II, when I think Steve kind of correctly intuited what I was about to say, and so he just yelled, "Shut up!" at the top of his lungs. And like, I guess I didn't signal him that I understood him, so he did it again, "Shut up!" even louder, and it's like everyone's looking at him. They finally got the message.
Steve Jobs had reason to be worried, but it was already too late. The damage was done. The bombshell hit a few months later. As if by miracle, PCs had caught up considerably. They had adopted a scroll-down menu and a mouse, all thanks to a new Microsoft program. Bill Gates had just released his own operating system, Windows, directly inspired by the brain of the Macintosh.
Steve found out about the Comdex thing, them announcing Windows. He said something like, I was president. He goes, "I want Bill Gates in this office before the sun goes down," or something like that, because he wanted to scream at him about it. But then at this meeting, Steve confronted Bill Gates. Well, you know, you said you weren't copying the Mac. You are copying the Mac. You betrayed us. How can we continue to work with you? How can we trust you? And Steve, you know, in any case, is really hard to stand up against. He can be very persuasive and very forceful. But I remember being extremely impressed at Bill Gates not giving an inch and just standing right up to him and you know, justifying himself.
Bill Gates had pulled it off. Windows would rapidly equip most of the computers on the planet at a price to beat all comers. For Apple, it was a disaster. Macintosh sales collapsed within weeks, and Steve Jobs' lucky star seriously began to fade.
Suddenly, for the first time in their history, they were really starting to worry about what would happen to the company because people weren't buying the Mac.
To get out of this crisis, John Scully, remember him? The guy Steve Jobs hired 2 years previously, was to take a measure thus far unthinkable. He fired the father of the Macintosh, Apple's historic founder. For Steve Jobs, it was a cruel disappointment. Banished from his own company at the age of 30.
It was unthinkable what happened. You know, it really was. It was something you never could have conceived because he was so core to what the place was. It just didn't make sense.
What had been the focus of my entire adult life was gone, and it was devastating. I really didn't know what to do for a few months.
The year is 1985, and Steve Jobs even envisages quitting Silicon Valley for good, doing something else. But he's a fighter, an extraordinary entrepreneur, so he sets up a new IT company called Next. In a sense, the follow-on to Apple. A year later, he buys Pixar Studios from George Lucas, which at the time was just a small special effects company. Pixar would go on to produce Toy Story, Finding Nemo, and The Incredibles, films that would revolutionize the world of animation. Once again, the man had flair. Years go by, Steve Jobs continues to develop new technologies, still with the somewhat crazy hope of changing the world. We met him in 1992 in his new offices in Silicon Valley. And as you'll see, back then he was already imagining the 21st century.
What is my dream today? This is a very French question. I guess I think computers are just in their infancy today. So maybe they've come this far in the last 30 years. Everyone having a computer isn't enough anymore. We have to have them start to work together to do some amazing things.
Steve Jobs, as visionary as ever. Only 37 years old, he still has the time to create all that he has in mind. In the meantime, in the mid-90s, Bill Gates has taken his place. His company, Microsoft, has an undivided grip over the IT world. It's a phenomenal economic powerhouse and a quasi-monopoly. 97% of the world computers run his Windows system. On the other hand, since Steve Jobs' departure, Apple has continued to lose ground. The firm is sorely in need of renewal. Its market share collapsed to only 3%. On February 5th, 1997, a Business Week headline reads, "The Fall of an American Icon."
Apple was really on a spiral towards its demise. It had gone through a number of leaders. None of them had been successful. People had lost confidence in it. Even loyal customers and fans were beginning to switch to regular PCs.
At the time, Apple has just hired a new CEO, Gilbert Amelio. John Sculley, Jobs' sworn enemy, has been shown the door. Gilbert Amelio decides to risk his all. He plays his last card, calling upon the man of the moment, the guru of the company's beginnings, symbol of Apple's golden age, Steve Jobs. He's now 42, and as always, he's got a head full of ideas. August 97, the founder signs his return with a mega show worthy of the good old days. Awaited like the Messiah by the brand's remaining loyal fans, Steve Jobs announces a rescue package to pull Apple back from the brink, and it kicks off with a dramatic turn of events.
I'd like to announce one of our first partnerships today, a very, very meaningful one, and that is one with Microsoft.
The audience is stunned.
I know.
Some think it's a joke, but Steve Jobs is dead serious.
Rather than repeating history, I'm extremely proud of both companies that they have resolved these differences in a very, very professional way. And I happen to have a special guest with me today via satellite downlink. And if we could get him up on the stage right now.
And here's his special guest, the man who betrayed him a few years earlier, Bill Gates.
Good morning.
For the booing audience, Gates is the devil incarnate.
Some of the most exciting work that I've done in my career has been the work that I've done with Steve on the Macintosh.
The two arch enemies have done the unthinkable and signed a secret agreement resolving their differences. Steve Jobs drops all legal proceedings against Bill Gates, whom he had accused of copying his Macintosh, In return, Bill supplies Steve with programs for his computers and a nice fat check for $150 million. It looks very much like a pact with the devil, but Steve Jobs is willing to do anything to bring Apple back from the brink. Back from the brink, but also, and most importantly, to revive the brand. And no one can do that better than Steve Jobs, because his greatest assets and lethal weapons are the products he sells.
And so, this is how we're going to re-enter the consumer market.
They look like giant translucent sour balls. Nice bright colors to reinvent the flailing Macintosh, making it a good deal sexier than the dull gray PC. It's not bad technology-wise either. No tower, no disk drive, an internal modem, a user-friendly interface, even for kids, with everything packed into the monitor. And on top of that, at a sales price of $1,300, people can now afford it. It's called the iMac.
Because we want to be the computer company that makes the best and coolest computers in the world for you.
Steve Jobs, the prodigal son, has a triumphant homecoming. His new baby, the iMac, announces the internet era, and Steve's giant suites sell like hotcakes. Apple is back in the pink. But already Steve Jobs' thoughts are elsewhere. He has incredible foresight, far beyond just computers. Having democratized computing, Apple launches itself boldly onto the entertainment mass market. Music is its new playground, and Jobs brings out a curious little device for listening to it. The date is 23rd of October, 2001.
There it is, right there. It's called iPod. Coolest thing about iPod is that your entire music library fits in your pocket. Never before possible.
After the invention of the Macintosh, this is Apple's second major revolution. The iPod, the tiny digital portable music player, becomes a cult object and a veritable cultural phenomenon. It has changed the way we listen to music.
Hi, so we're doing a piece for French TV on the iPod. I just wanted to ask you what you like about your iPod.
It's easy. I have all my music on it, and I can just take it wherever I want to go.
It's amazing. It's the greatest thing ever.
What do you like about it?
I love everything about it.
The iPod enjoys planetary success and quickly becomes the world's #1 selling portable digital player. Apple has already sold 275 million of them, and along with the iPod comes iTunes, the inseparable application for managing your music, which Steve Jobs sells online. What's more, Apple sets the prices. €9.99 the album, and 99 euro cents the individual song. The music industry is at his feet, as Michel de Souza, former boss of a major record label, reports.
The part we didn't control, for example, was the public sales price. Apple imposed their infamous €9.99 price for albums and 99 cents for individual songs. As we couldn't get organized and come up with a joint offer, Apple imposed its 99-cent price, which has become today's market reference.
In fact, everyone's a winner, because Apple transfers part of its online sales to the record companies. On average, 60 cents per track. Thanks to its catalog, a year after its launch, the iTunes Store is selling 50 million songs, with 500 million the following year and over 10 billion today. And that's not all. Apple has other revolutions in the pipeline. But an unexpected revelation is to profoundly affect the course of events. In June 2004, Steve Jobs announced that he has pancreatic cancer, a serious form of cancer with a very poor prognosis. But Jobs is a fighter and treats every day that follows as another day to live life to the fullest. The following year, in June 2005, Stanford University makes Jobs, the self-taught man, a doctor honoris causa. Jobs addresses a captivated audience, speaking to them about death, but giving them, in fact, a lesson of life.
Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life.
He advises students not to let their lives pass them by and to actively pursue their dreams.
Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. Stay hungry, stay foolish. Thank you all very much.
It's a precept that Steve Jobs followed all his life. But on June 12, 2005, he knows his days are numbered. And accordingly, his sense of urgency is greater than ever because the master's work is not quite done. In the wake of computers and music came the telephone. On the 9th of January 2007, a bombshell hit the world of mobile phones.
A phone and an internet communicator. This is one device, and we are calling it iPhone.
In a perfectly choreographed show, Steve Jobs, like a messiah of modern times, launches his latest marvel with one ambition in mind: to make it the reference in mobile telephony. And above all, an event with the power to cause a stir. Upon its release, it's hysteria. All over the world, the same lines in front of the stores, with customers brandishing their iPhone like a trophy. The world of cell phones has never seen the likes. Within 3 years, Apple would sell 75 million iPhones. With renewed confidence, Steve Jobs takes the opportunity to revamp an old Apple product, a touchscreen tablet commercialized during his absence, which had been a total flop. At the time, in 1993, the idea may have been a good one, but it hadn't been formulated by the master, and that makes all the difference. 27th of January 2010, Steve Jobs presents his most ambitious creation to date. He's very weak due to his illness, but as excited as a kid with a new toy.
That's what it looks like. Very thin.
Yet for the first time, the specialists are wondering if Steve Jobs hasn't made a mistake. Olivier Frigard watched this presentation live on the web. A journalist specializing in IT, he's followed Apple for a long time, and today he's skeptical.
For once, Apple was taking a risk. They hadn't been taking any major risks as they were entering already existing markets. They launched the iPod. It was a Walkman. They didn't invent that. And then came the iPhone. This time they were launching an oddity, a touchscreen tablet computer. There were similar products on the market, but lacking the Apple aura, they never really caught on. Apple was taking a real risk of getting it wrong, of making a product that people in fact did not want.
What's more, where does one situate it? It's a hybrid product, halfway between a laptop computer and a mobile phone. No USB port, no DVD player, no webcam. The iPad is disconcerting. But Steve Jobs doesn't doubt, in any case he never does, and as it seems, rightly so, because the iPad is another resounding success. It's also a goldmine for the company, given that apart from its inherent functions, the iPad is a gigantic online store where one can find hundreds of thousands of pay-to-download applications. And, of course, on each purchase, Apple takes its cut. Yet the most impressive thing of all is that thanks to the iPad, we are entering a new IT era.
Without going overboard, we felt that we were experiencing a crucial turning point in IT history. What we were witnessing was perhaps the death of the computer, with a new breed of products accessible to everyone.
With the Mac, the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, and the iPad, Steve Jobs managed to fulfill part of his dream. He who promised to make the computer as easy to use as a toaster will have at least won his bet: to make IT part of our everyday lives. That had been his reason for living for over 30 years, and in a sense, he did change the world. The story is far from over, but Steve Jobs had to retire from the race. On March 2nd, 2011, he made his last presentation before a very emotional audience. Then on August 24th, worn out from illness, he chose to step aside and to resign as CEO of Apple. Having been confronted with death for so long, he lived each day as if it were the last. And doubtless, that is why his final years at the helm of Apple were so creative. Then, on October 5th, 2011, death finally caught up with him. Apple, one of the richest companies in the world, is now an orphan.
We've got a great hands-on area, and I'd really encourage you, go get your hands on one of these things. You won't believe it. Thank you very much.